Welcome to Conversations with Authors and Innovators, where these are timely recorded conversations with authors, thought leaders, and entrepreneurs. I am here with Doug Banks, executive editor of the BBJ. He is not wearing his standard bow tie today. He will wear that, of course, for Authors and Innovators, our week-long event in the fall. Today, Doug and I talk with Geoff Jones, professor of business history at Harvard Business School. Professor Jones is a prolific author. He's written extensively about profit sustainability and what values-driven leadership really means. His latest book, Deeply Responsible Business, A Global History of Values-Driven Leadership, is a must-read. Professor Jones, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Tell us, why this book, why now, and why deeply responsible versus corporate responsibility?
I mean, why now is there's, as you know, a lot of chatter about companies needing a purpose, that capitalism is irredeemably flawed, the cause of all the crises and things. So I wanted to join the debate and join it using my knowledge as a historian, really, to bring something new to the table. So I went in search of responsible businesses. Why did I call it deeply responsible? Because I didn't want people to think this is yet another book about corporate social responsibility, which is kind of like, I wanted to talk about the kind of responsibilities I put in the book that, dramatically save civilization, that doesn't just give away 5% of revenues to that good cause or that good cause, but really at its essence attempts to make society and the environment a better place. So I came up with this term, deeply responsible. Deeply responsible.
And it's so fitting. It's more than just virtue signaling. It's more than just greenwashing. Doug, I know you love the local connections that Professor Jones writes about as well.
I did. I'm not gonna lie. I took notes on this book. I literally, as someone who's been covering Boston businesses for over 25 years, I absolutely was fascinated by all of the local connections. Edward Feline and Wang, Tepper Marlin and Joan Bavaria, who created the predecessor firm to Trillium Asset Management. Even some, George Romney, who's the father, of course, of the former Massachusetts Senator and Governor Mitt Romney. There was just so much. And then, expanding to Tom's of Maine and Ben and Jerry's, there was just countless examples. I was wondering, we could talk. I would love to talk to you for hours on this, but would you just share a little bit about Edward Feline's contribution? I was fascinated to learn, for example, not only about his business model and his passionate deep responsibility, but also the credit union, the creation of credit unions as and the mission there.
Feline is somebody, people of a certain age in Boston, right, know about Filene's basement and all of that. And I think he's somebody who deserves a lot more attention because he's a successful retailer, but one with this very strong feeling against inequality and injustice. And so he built his whole business as a way to try and change that. I mean, first of all, he believes in selling at lowest prices and paying the best wages, but that's not enough for him. So he actually has this plan to hand over the ownership of his business to his employees, which doesn't play out. Which is interesting, but the vision and the perception, I think, that ownership of assets is really important if you're going to seriously address inequality issues. And yes, you're right. I mean, in some ways, I argue he achieves even more outside his firm than inside his firm. So he not only attempts to combat corruption in Boston city government, which doesn't really work as well as it could have done.
During the James Ken Curley days.
A significant task. He wasn't quite up to that one, but nevertheless, he does bankroll the credit union movement because he realizes, again, that many people don't have access to capital, and the way for them to achieve betterment was to provide a means to access capital. And that's exactly what the credit union movement does. And it's enormously successful. By the 1930s, there are there are hundreds of credit unions scattered around the country, and Filin puts his name and he puts his money into making that happen. And that's a huge contribution, I think. He deserves to be much better known.
Right, especially to a community, and he had a real problem with fake news.
Well,
Did he not?
I mean, that's the contemporary relevance of Filin, because by the 1930s you have the advent of the Nazi regime in Germany, and I mean they're the pioneers of fake news. That's what they do, and that's how they take over a whole population and reprogram it. Filin is extremely aware of that, so he sets up this institute to combat fake news, nativism, anti-Semitism, and it's all very contemporary. And once again, he's putting his name and his money and his time. He's not just complaining about things, he's actually doing things.
It was absolutely fascinating, and here we are 100 years later, still seeing a lot of the same things play out again, talking about these same topics. Another angle to some of the businesses that you cover that really interested me was sort of the next generation of companies, the Celestial Seasonings Tea, Ben and Jerry's, Patagonia, as I mentioned, Tom's of Maine, and then the Body Shop, some of which were really great examples of deep responsibility while they were under their founding ownership, but then they weren't able to, almost time and time again, they weren't able to make it last. Could you talk a little bit about how companies today can learn from the mistakes of the past, those companies that had a great mission, maybe not the Body Shop, which, as you talked about, was more of an example of greenwashing than it was maybe deeply responsibility. But some of those other companies, I think, really did mean well, but couldn't make it last.
A couple of trends you can see. One is growth tends to be the enemy of values. And it turns out it's like really hard to keep the values once you're growing, and several things go wrong. The fatal thing is letting in outside capital, and that's the paradox, because in order to grow and be a successful business, you need outside capital. Once you do that, the owners of capital typically don't share the vision, and they typically want better bottom line performance at other things. So that's one trap. I mean, the Patagonia Yvon Chouinard identified exactly that growth is going to get you. But the other problem is succession, because a lot of these businesses, you've got these visionary people, but their kids or professional managers don't share that, and the energy just sort of seeps out of the business. And so that is what Patagonia has addressed last year by the family basically gifting their ownership to a trust, a perpetual trust, which cannot lose sight of its mission, because its mission is embedded in its statutes. And that kind of ownership structure, I think, is one way to keep the mission going. And
Right. You talked about that in the steward ownership model, the other model being B corporations, which are something that we at the Boston Business Journal have been definitely covering over the past several years as they proliferated. But there's so many more today. But the B corporations that in your book you do mention, they tend to be small and
they
stay
do.
small.
And I mean, one trouble with B Corp is you can also un-B Corp yourself, which is why this sort of the perpetual stewardship model is probably a more sustainable model. But I mean, you could say, I mean, there is an issue that large public companies are not following that example. But you could say that many of the founders of B Corps actually want to make the world a better place rather than grow into multi-billion-dollar businesses. So it's not necessarily, I think, a failure that they don't grow. And I think in their own terms, if you ask a lot of them, do you want to be a billion-dollar business? They'd probably say, no, we want to do some good in this world. And I think that's fine, as a matter of fact.
So it's a bit of a consequence of growth. Uh, Jeff, you talk about the three broad principles that deeply responsible businesses have when they start out. We have so many entrepreneurs, CEOs, investors listening to us. Can you give them a sense of how you describe throughout the book how real leaders understand that their actions have consequences and that they can make profits by choosing actions that have good consequences? It's this false dichotomy, I guess, or narrative, I should say, that shareholder primacy always means, enduringly means, profits first and only.
If anybody is listening, I mean, one takeaway from the book is you don't have to be some sort of like saint or martyr. And all the people I talk about have their flaws, they have their failings. That's wrong, and I think that's actually an important lesson. They are regular, normal people, and yet they have this view that the business that they do should add value rather detract from value. They have this view, right, that communities matter, whether it's Boston or somewhere else, and they have the view that a business has a license to operate from society, basically,
Right.
and you draw things from that society, and it's appropriate to support that society to grow. Um, I mean, this is what these people are doing. It's not that they are anti-shareholders or anti-capitalist at all. They just realize that they owe something to the societies that enable them to flourish as businesses.
I thought that was such a powerful part of the book, and something certainly I tell my law students, that corporate means of or relating to the body of the community. And that's a really critical point that I think you convey so well in the book. Lots and lots of local connections. Want to hear about what you're reading these days, Jeff?
What am I reading? Um, Actually, I was just reading a book on communist China called Mao and Markets, which deals with this puzzle of how China, after the opening in the late 1970s, from this apparently totally totalitarian socialist society, is able to get this like flourishing capitalist society within 10 or 15 years. And it's a really good read. The author is called Chris Marquez, who's now in was at Cornell, now he's in Cambridge, and he helped solve this. He helped solve this puzzle by looking actually what happened in the Mao period, even before the the opening to China. There were sort of markets and private entrepreneurs even then. It's a great piece of work, deeply informed by China, because
And a great book to revisit. One of the things that struck me, and I know it struck Doug when we talked a bit before, was how global your reach is and how global the instinct for people who might be inspired by their faith, their tradition, their culture, to actually do something different than everybody else as they're starting a business.
I wanted to write a global study, but as we began by talking, one of the paradoxes is that Boston is all over is all over the book, even though I set out
Right.
to do deliberately to do a global book, and I mean that says something about
No, it's not.
our
It's
thinking
not at
and our
all.
region.
It's not at all parochial. It's
It, no, it is not. I mean, you talk about Cadbury and the Quaker tradition there, Tata, and in what took place in India, and there's just you really did cover multiple, both the religions and the nations, and the fascinating model in Japan, and why B Corps don't work in Japan, because you don't need certification when your culture says this is what you should do. I thought it was, again, just fascinating.
me too. This is so well done, Jeff, and I hope everyone will get this. Doug, in addition to finishing Deeply Responsible Business, what are you reading?
Also, in addition to finishing this one, I'm also reading Red Card: How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal by Ken Benzinger. It dropped about 5 years ago in 2018, but as a soccer aficionado, it's been on my shelf, and I finally picked it up about a week or so ago. And it's the account of the FIFA scandal, the international corruption and bribery that took place and takes place, really globally. Speaking of globally. And it's just an absolute fascinating read to me. It's nothing surprising. It's stuff that, because it's been in the news for so long. I knew all about it, but the book goes into such great depth and detail. It's a fascinating read.
That seems terrific. Title and author again?
It's Ken Benzinger is the author, and it's Red Card: How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. And our IRS, tax evasion, and FBI power was able to win when everyone else in the country, nations couldn't do it, I guess.
Always happens that way. I followed up Deeply Responsible Business with a couple of other history books that I'm going to recommend to Professor Jones. The first is brand new, Paved Paradise: How Parking Explains the World. A fascinating history about parking, urban policy, and planning. Henry Grabar, staff writer at Slate, wrote it. It is one of those incredibly engaging, fun, irritating books when you read about how Chicago effectively leased 36,000 parking meters to Morgan Stanley and got $1 billion in return. And shortly thereafter, the securitization memo from Morgan Stanley valued that suite of products at $9 billion. And so I found this just amazing, particularly as that kind of a contract, a 75-year contract, now really circumscribes what Chicago can do around moving meters, guaranteed minimums. Fascinating and infuriating book, but really, really fun. And of course, I followed that up with one. Doug knows I'm a huge history buff of especially Robert Caro and his LBJ series, King: A Life. Jonathan Eich's book is just a tour de force. This is really one of the first authoritative biographies in over 40 years of MLK. Defines him as a person, really has its own Boston connections. I don't think I quite knew that one of the reasons he was at BU pursuing a degree was that his soon-to-be wife, Coretta, was a promising student at the New England Conservatory. So just a really, really fascinating book, and I urge folks to get that as well. So we've had a lot of fun today talking with Professor Jones about Deeply Responsible Business, a global history of values-driven leadership. And as I was joking with Professor Jones before we got on, it prompted me also to pick up his Profits and Sustainability book. Really, if you want to learn more about these topics, we strongly, strongly recommend that you take a look at this. If you are a history buff, if you are a business buff, if you are looking for a Father's Day or Significant Other's Day book, this is the book that you ought to pick up and read on the beach this summer. Professor Jones, thank you so much for joining us. Doug, I'll see you next time.
Sounds great. Thank you.